So those that have joined us, thank you so much, and welcome to this first Talking History with Humphreys and Reed. And we're discussing Major General Lethbridge, his war from the Great War through to Hitler's bunker and indeed probably beyond. And we're joined by members of his family here today. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of our discussion. It's not a talk. We're going to discuss aspects of his life and history, and what some of the objects that the family have got with them, what that means to them, and some photographs. But at the end of the discussion, you will be able to ask a question. In your Zoom portal, there is a reactions panel where you can raise your hand. And at the end of it, if you can kind of raise your hand if you want to ask a question. This is a recorded meeting, so if you're not meant to be here and you don't want to be in the recording, then you need to leave now. Otherwise, we will deem that you're quite happy with that and we will carry on. So, welcome to you both. And Victoria, I don't know if you kind of want to say anything before we start as well.
Yeah, well, I think most people kind of know who I am now. My name's Victoria Humphreys. I generally write historical fiction, but I'm interested in history in general. And I know Milo, and then learned of Milo's amazing family story and his amazing mother, and asked them if they would like to talk about their family history with us. And I'm very grateful to them for accepting the offer. And yeah, that's why we're here today.
Okay, so I think we'll kind of pass over to you guys, and kind of, if we start, I mean, he entered the army at the time of the Great War. He was in that generation, that kind of Edwardian age leading up to the Great War, and he entered the war as a young officer in the Royal Engineers, I believe.
Yes, he went into the army in 1915 straight from school. He had no gap at all between leaving school and going out to France, straight onto the Somme. He was at Ypres and then in the Somme. He was 17 at the time. His mother saw him off with a packet of 1,000 cigarettes as a good luck present. And he stayed in France right through the war, in the trenches and at Ypres, and only left at the end of the war when his regiment, he was in the Bengal sappers and miners, was to return to India, when he boarded a ship going back to India via the Suez Canal and was torpedoed close to Malta. He was on a ship called the Cameronia, which was sunk, and after several hours in the water, he was picked up by a fishing vehicle and put ashore on the island of Malta. And after that, he rejoined another ship, went to India, and went straight to war again. This was 1919, and it was the Third Afghan War, where he was awarded the Military Cross.
And I think that that period of his, what for most people is something they don't kind of connect with, that period of conflict, what was going on in India in the post First World War world, had as much of a profound effect on him as his experience in the trenches of the Great War.
Yes, indeed. It was horrendous. There were terrible atrocities. And yes, he was deeply traumatized, though he never showed it. He was a very stoical man, a very brave, stoical man. And then after Afghanistan, he stayed for 10 years in India until it was obvious that Hitler was on the rampage in Europe. And he was told to return to the United Kingdom to help with the rearmament, and he had a job in the War Office. And he was there until the outbreak of war, when he again went to war, first going to the South Pacific in charge of something called the Lethbridge mission, which was to examine the type of armaments that would be needed for jungle warfare against the Japanese. So he traveled around the South Pacific and he made his report, returned to the War Office, and then was sent to Burma. where he was Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Slim and was right through the Burma campaign with the 14th Army until the surrender in 1945, August 1945, when he actually received a sword from General Yamamoto, who was one of the Japanese High Command, which he took home with him. And I remember it well as a child, a Japanese ceremonial sword with a shark skin handle.
Extraordinary.
So,
I mean, just that kind of brief overview of his involvement in conflict, from the trenches of the Western Front through to the jungles of Burma. That's already an extraordinary life in its own way, really.
well, it was, and then it never stopped. As soon as the war finished, he was sent to Germany with the British Army of the Rhine as Chief of Intelligence. And he was stationed in Herford, which is a small town in North Rhine-Westphalia. And there he had his headquarters. He investigated war crimes and helped to prepare the ground for the Nuremberg trials. He cooperated with his opposite numbers among the Americans, the French, and the Russians. He used to go up to Berlin once a month to meet his colleagues, his international colleagues. And he also was involved in things like the Operation Paperclip, which saw the sending of high-ranking Germans who really should have stood trial as war criminals at Nuremberg, but who were in fact sent to America to help on the development of the atomic bomb. And it's one of those morally dubious episodes in British history, which hasn't been fully explored yet. But one of your colleagues at, I think, Nottingham University.
That's right.
No,
Yes, that's right.
at Nottingham.
Liverpool.
Yes, is writing a thesis on this, and also the rise of far-right partisans in Germany and the threat that they posed, the peaceful settlement. So that was, again, an enormously interesting and traumatic period of his life. And it only came to an end when he developed lung cancer at the end of the 1940s and had major surgery. He lived 10 more years, but he was very scarred by his illness. Died finally in 1961, having only been in retirement for 1 year.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. Nemone, just returning to the bunker there, I think, as we've come to that kind of period in the story, I wonder if this might be a good time for the reading that you proposed from your book.
Yes,
about that time.
I'll explain how this came about. I was 13 years old at the time. My brother was 9, and my little sister was coming up to 4. And we were sent for the school holidays to join our father in Germany, which we did. And we stayed at Herford. We had a bit of a hard time there because we were told to go and play and to skate on the river. But the German children didn't like us because we were British and used to stone us with snowballs filled with very large hard stones. And so in the end, we retreated indoors. And I spent my time reading the Brontes. And then one day, my father, who was about to make one of his monthly trips to Berlin, said that we should accompany him to Berlin, which we did. And we spent a very interesting period in Berlin. And then I'll start reading from there. My father said one day, "Tomorrow is our last day in Berlin. We're not going to waste it. I'm going to show you something which probably no other English children have seen. I'm going to take you to the place where Hitler died. So it was back into the Maybach, back through the Romanesque pillars of the Brandenburg Gate, amazingly still standing in the middle of the desolation, back through the mean streets of the Russian sector of Berlin, under the beady eye of Uncle Joe. There were pictures of Stalin everywhere on every wall. He really had replaced Hitler as the Führer. I was thinking to myself that I'd really had enough of bomb buildings, but when we arrived at the Reich Chancellery, I could see that this place was different. It was absolutely huge. Outside, there was the usual tangle of razor wire and a sullen huddle of Red Army soldiers. Inside, one could see that although the roof was gone and many of the walls, enough remained to enable one to see the ground plan. The chancellery must have been the size of a small cathedral. A few yards from the perimeter of the chancellery stood a low concrete structure, undamaged by bomb or shell. It looked like an enlarged coal bunker or boiler room. At one corner rose a 12-foot pepper pot, cement grey and streaked with soot and dirt. This was added to prevent anyone pouring poison gas into the ventilator shaft, said my father. There must have been plenty of people who attempted to do just that. Opposite stood an iron door, like the one that may be seen on an old-fashioned safe, but twice the size. Excuse me. This is our final port of call, said my father. This is where the most loathsome regime the world has ever known came to its squalid and ignoble end. He rattled the door. Damn, he said, bloody thing's locked. Bishop was his ADC. Be a good fellow and find somebody with a key. We stood in the rubble, our breath drifting like smoke in front of us in the bitter air. I wished that I was anywhere else in the world. I shut my eyes and imagined myself in the kitchen at Black Dog. That was our house in Somerset, warming my back against the Aga and breathing in the spicy aroma of gingerbread, gently baking in the bottom oven. Then the keys arrived with a surly posse and were grudgingly handed to my father. Michael Bishop gave each one of us a torch. Slowly, the heavy doors swung open. There was an exhalation of foul air, as though an ogre below had belched in his sleep. 10 years later, that smell hit me with a stab of recognition, as for the first time, I watched an usher at the Old Bailey cut open a bag of blood-stained exhibits, polluting the air with the fetid aroma of sudden death. The colour drained from my mother's face. Jack, she said, do you really think this is suitable? No, I don't, not really, he said. But I still think they shouldn't miss the chance of seeing a bit of history. Well, said my mother, I'm going to wait in the car with Cherry, who of course was only 4. Inside, the bunker was as black as pitch. Cautiously, with the aid of torches, we made our way down a short flight of concrete steps, then sharp left into another corridor and down another flight of steps. On the left was a row of rooms, which my father unlocked one by one. They seemed to have been kitchens or storerooms. Everything of value or use had been looted or smashed. Then, passing through a bulkhead, we entered a wide passage with doors on each side. My father unlocked them too. They appeared to have been servants' quarters, but as we'd come to expect, the contents of each had been smashed to pieces or removed. The last 2 doors were, as usual, locked. My father couldn't find the keys to fit them on the bunch. Maybe it's just as well, he said. These must have been the rooms where Frau Goebbels and her children had their quarters. She was the wife of the Minister of Propaganda. You mean there were children down here, I asked. Yes, 6 of them. The Goebbels killed them all. Their own children. Yes, indeed. Why did they have to do that? Maybe they didn't want them to fall into the hands of the Russians. Did they think they'd go to heaven? The Goebbels didn't believe in heaven, my father said. They believed in historical necessity, whatever that is. We came to a spiral staircase leading down. Are you game? Asked my father. Of course, Peter and I replied, trying hard to sound as though we meant it. There was no banister. We crept down, our hands on the outside wall. Now we could hear the drip, drip of water. We were so deep underground that the 30 degrees of frost had failed to penetrate the subsoil, and foul water was liberated from its icy hibernation. Another row of locked doors, each opening to reveal the usual scene of destruction. The last to be opened contained nothing but a sofa, unvandalized and covered with pale patterned velveteen and defiled by a terrible brown stain. My father slammed the door and locked it firmly. The passage was now awash with filthy water. I could feel it seeping through the soles of my boots. Oh God, I thought to myself, this is Bluebeard's castle. Please don't let him find any more keys. I saw that somebody had dumped in the middle of the passage. Can we go now? I pleaded. Yes, said my father. I think we've seen enough. Back along the passage, up the spiral stairs, the sound of dripping water receding behind us. Along the labyrinthine passages, up 2 more flights of stairs, and finally, our hearts pounding, we were out at last into the sweet, cold afternoon air.
Wow.
That is the passage you wanted.
That's lovely. Sorry, you go, Paul.
I was just that it's an extraordinary account, and I mean, how do you feel now, looking back, over 7 decades? You've been in Hitler's bunker. You went in there at that point where everything that period was came to an end in the dark troglodyte passageways of that bunker. How does it make you feel now to look back on that?
It was horrifying, but at the same time, I feel very privileged, because shortly after that, the Russians blew it up, and so nobody else saw it. They didn't want the area to become a shrine for the werewolves and the neo-Nazis, so they destroyed the whole thing. The room with the sofa must have been the room where Hitler killed himself, and the stain on the sofa must have been his blood.
It's amazing.
Extraordinary.
It is extraordinary to have your account, Nemone, is amazing, but also I think really interestingly, it's seen through the eyes of a child as well, and that makes it even more unique for us, because children, they don't really embellish in that way, that perhaps adults do. It's just kind of like a more kind of pure account in some respects. So for us to have that account from you forever is amazing. But one of the things that I'm interested in is afterwards, did you ever talk about that experience with your father? Did he ever express any regret for taking you there, or did it prey on your mind as the years went by? Or
no, he told us in great detail the story of Hitler's death, and of course Eva Braun, who died with him, his wife of 24 hours. And then, of course, the Goebbels. And what really haunted me, and still does, is the death of the Goebbels' children. There were 6 children. They were aged 12 to a toddler. And they were killed by their own parents, who called in an SS doctor and dentist who had originally been mandated to put down Hitler's dog. And they were told, well, why you kill the dog? You might as well kill the children at the same time. And then when the Russians found the little bodies, they had been sedated with morphine and then killed. But the eldest child, Helga, had obviously resisted her murderer. and she was covered with bruises. But the bodies were taken to Russia for post-mortem, cremated, and the ashes were thrown into the river Elbe. But I was haunted by the thought of those poor children, and still am.
Yeah.
Of all the crimes the Nazis committed, perhaps that was one of the worst.
It kind of feels...
The two girls went upstairs and they were shot by the SS on their orders. They said, now please shoot us. And they shot them both. Hitler's body was burned on a bonfire with Eva Braun. Somebody had been mandated to collect a lot of petrol. He'd been told to get 200 litres, but he couldn't because there's a great shortage. So the bodies weren't totally destroyed, and there was enough of Hitler's skull left for his dentist to identify his dental records. And this is how we were sure that Hitler had perished there, when a lot of people, including the neo-Nazis, wanted to put out the story that he had gone to South America and was planning to come back.
I think it's a really important point to make even today, Nemone, because there are still people walking this earth who believe that Hitler survived that bunker and went off. People today are still making that claim. So it's really lovely to have the opportunity to sit here with you today and make it very clear to anybody who's in any doubt that your father, Major General Lethbridge, was responsible for proving categorically that Hitler died in that bunker and his body was cremated, not entirely successfully, in the grounds of that bunker.
Yes, well, luckily there was enough left for his dentist to identify his jaw.
Yeah.
And then the Goebbels were put on the bonfire, but there wasn't enough petrol to burn them. So they were left really scorched, but virtually intact.
Yeah. Yeah, very important.
Yes.
Well, like Victoria says, it is important because, I mean, when I go to Berlin now, they've the bunker has got blocks of flats on top of it now, and there's a car park there. And for many years, there was nothing to indicate that this was the site of Hitler's bunker. It's only when you looked at a plan of the streets, which is pretty identical to when you were there, and then kind of measured almost, that you could work out where the bunker was. But the Berlin...
Is there anything left of the Chancellery?
All gone. The whole building was completely demolished. Yeah, they're all modern buildings there now.
Yes.
But the layout of the street is the same. So you can stand there and look at a modern glass-fronted building, and look at 1930s images and then 1945 images of what was once there, and you can kind of match it up. But the most talked over aspect now, they've put a panel up with a map of the bunker and some photographs of the bunker. But people go there now not to talk about Hitler's end and death there. They go there to debate whether Hitler survived because of recent television series, Hunting Hitler, and the whole debate over that. So it's important to always go back to the facts, and the work that your father did there to prove all this is really historically massively important.
It is. These people are the same as the Holocaust deniers, and they are complete fantasists, but very dangerous. Very dangerous. And then, of course, some of the high command escaped, including Martin Bormann. And well, I've got a story to tell about Martin Bormann, but
please do. please do. If you want to share it with us, Nemone, please do.
It's a silly story, but when I went back to school after we returned from Germany, my friend Dione and I were convinced that Martin Bormann was in fact the boiler man in the school. And we used to creep down to the boiler room, and we saw this sinister figure with a thick neck and short hair, and a little radio which was chattering away in what we thought was a foreign language. And we said, oh, he's making contact with the werewolves. And we wondered whether we should tell the headmistress that a dangerous war criminal was in the cellar. Which we had scruples about this because we were horrified at the thought of him being hanged. Even then, I was strongly against the death penalty, and I didn't want to be responsible for such an atrocity. So we debated what to do. But then one day we went down to the cellar and he wasn't there. But the little radio was chattering away to itself. And we crept up. And what it was not the German radio contacting the werewolves, but Tommy Handley on Itmar. It's that man again, the BBC comedy show.
But I wonder, you know, there's me saying, Nemone, your bunker account's great because it's through the child's eyes and it's, you know, it's so pure. And now we've gone to this amazing story about Martin Bormann. But, you know, one might argue that that could be your way of trying to deal with the trauma of what you saw in Berlin and trying to come to terms with, you know, the stories that you heard from your father about that history.
It could be, yes. I hadn't thought of that. But we were seriously concerned.
Yeah, because you were in the, you know, I mean, you know, so many children are shielded from those kind of facts, and so not only were you given the facts, but you were taken to the place. So, you know, something like that's bound to have left, you know, a mark, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And of course, Martin Bormann, they never found out what happened to him.
No.
Sufficiently, even now, he's listed as missing.
Wow.
It has never been established.
This is just a kind of little question, but just returning to Hitler's jaw, why didn't they keep, I mean, did they dispose of the jaw? I just, in a way, it would have been a useful thing to keep to prove for future generations from, you know, DNA point of view, etc., that he did perish there.
Well, I think it was felt that the dentist's evidence was enough.
Yeah.
I mean, dental records are used all the time in criminal investigations because they're very accurate.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happened to it. It's probably in a forensic laboratory somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm sure it wasn't disposed of.
Right.
I think there was a piece of skull that was kept in the Moscow archives for a long time that was thought to have been a piece of Hitler's skull, but recent DNA kind of examination of it has proven that actually it's from an unidentified female. So I think sometime the decision was made. Some of these Hitler artifacts, if you like, did survive, but I think they were subsequently cremated and then disposed of for exactly the same reasons of fear of them becoming, you know, icons.
Icons, exactly. Like, you know, bits of, Jesus is, you know, shroud, etc. I wonder if I could bring Milo in here, because Milo and I had a conversation about, you know, our grandfathers. My grandfather died the year before I was born, and I have very little photographs or anything of him. I don't really know what he looks like. I know very little about him. And in a way, I haven't ever come to know him through images or artifacts. And I know, Milo, you have images and you have artifacts. It would be lovely to kind of, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of those with us. And you know, I tweeted earlier about this quote of Ernest Dichter, if I could just say, he was a psychologist, and he kind of called the objects that we collect and treasure links in the chain of life. And he suggested that if it breaks, you know, we're truly lost. And lately I've been thinking about the importance of objects and how they embody our sense of selfhood and identity. And so kind of with that in mind, Milo, it'd be really interesting to hear about how perhaps you've come to know your grandfather through the objects that were left to you.
Yeah, absolutely. My grandmother had a house in Devon when we were growing up, and we used to go spend every half term and holiday there. And the study was still absolutely intact, his study, and it had all his books, and it had every weapon that he brought back from war. So it had a Gurkha's kukri, it had Yamamoto's sword on the wall, it had his medals, 13 medals in a case. You know, I just stare at these as a child for hours, thinking, bloody hell, you know, who was this guy? He was you know, phenomenal. And it was almost as if he just stepped out of the room. But of course, he wasn't there. I never knew him. He died 11 years before I was born, so I never knew him. But my grandmother was vivid in her description and her love of him, and she would talk about him. And I was always interested, and I ended up doing a degree in archaeology because I became obsessed with just, you know, the historical links to the past and artifacts, because they do link us, they do. And I think over time your perspective changes and develops, so that what matters to you when you're 8 years old, you know, evolves to when you're 18, to when you're 28, to when you, and I'm so glad that I was interested, because I've got these amazing artifacts now. My grandmother was clearly impressed on her that I really valued these things. I understood them and what they meant. So she left me these things, and I've got them here. This is his battlefield telescope, and it's got a note from my grandmother attached to it saying, JSL Lethbridge telescope, this belongs to Milo. And he carried this through the First War, Third Afghan War, Second War. God only knows what this has seen. You know, what has this seen? That is a treasure. It needs a slight repair because it's got a bit of damage on it. Again, who knows? You know, retro repair shop, they ignored us, but it is a fantastic thing. And then when my grandfather was sunk on the Cameronia, the survivors formed a Cameronia society, which became a sort of a social group of friends in India. My grandmother became an honorary member, known as Stowaway. They all had nautical names, and when they were married in 1925, they gave a silver boat, which is this, and it's got the coxswain, which is my grandfather, Stowaway, my grandmother, the 15th of August 1925, from the crew of the HMT Cameronia. And again, it's just there. And I don't know which I love more, but this is perhaps one of the most incredible. This is a silver cigarette case, and you can see his initials on there. And when you open it, it's got the most incredible, and I'm going to try and show you the inscription. I don't know if you'll be able to read that, but I'll read it for you.
Yeah, we can't see that, unfortunately.
It says to Tubby, with best wishes, Intelligence Division, December 1947.
Wow.
I won't take up smoking again, but I will, you know, I will always treasure that.
Yeah. Which kind of leads us to something we briefly mentioned last night, doesn't it, Milo, about when we did the Twitter spaces with yourself and your mother. I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, do you know why your grandfather was called Tubby? How he achieved that nickname? And at the time, I remember thinking, well, if he was always with Slim, wouldn't it just be that somebody would say, well, you're Slim and we'll call you Tubby, like Little and Large or Laurel and Hardy? But I just felt too embarrassed to suggest it as an idea. But when we talked about it last night, you suggested that might be how it came about.
Yeah, we have no idea, do we?
Yeah, because he never was Tubby.
No.
He was rather athletic.
Yeah.
And he was of medium height, and what the police always say, a proportionate weight.
Yeah.
So he was under 6 foot, about 5'10", and I suppose about 13 stone.
So I love your theory, because it fits. Yeah, yes. It's the most plausible thing we've ever heard. So I think you may have cracked it.
Excellent. That's the code cracked for that one.
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. But you know, just going back to those objects, and you know, what do they mean to you though, Milo? What, you know, how do you kind of see them now?
I love them. I hold them very dear. They are a connection with the past. you know, I never knew the guy. I wish, there's been many points in my life, I wish I could have spoken to him, got some advice from him, got some guidance. But they are a guide in itself. They're inspiration. We all go through tough times in life, right? And I reflect and think, this guy was very tough. And when you have your own little problems, whatever they are, they sort of pale into, so they're very inspirational, because you think, okay, if I've got a bad time about this, it's nothing, it's fine. It's, you know, if I've got a hard time at work with a colleague at work or whatever, it's nothing, it's fine. And so it does give you massive strength, it gives you inspiration. And to hold them in your hand, it makes it real, because without holding them in your hand, it all seems a bit, and you know, some of the stories are so fantastic, it's very hard to talk about them in normal company, because people don't believe you. They think, well, you know, what, your grandfather made, what, Hitler's bunker, really? Oh, right, okay, yeah, nice one, yeah. So it makes it all real. It reminds you that this is all, and it makes you behave. It gives you an absolute moral compass to say, let's behave yourself and be good and do the right thing, because that's what he did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think those objects are a reminder that he's part of you forever. Yeah. You know, that's your link. You have the object which links you to the past, but the man that owned them is part of you, which is, I mean, he's an incredible man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to, well, certainly from my perspective, we need to understand where we come from to understand ourselves.
Yes.
We have to look back and understand why we are like we are, you know, why. And I love that. And it does give you a compass to live your life.
If we could just kind of go back to your book, Nemone, there's a passage in there where you describe an atrocity that your father witnessed in the Third Anglo-Afghan War of 1919. And I wondered if you or Milo would be prepared to read it as an example of really the things that your father kind of absorbed and never really had the opportunity to speak about until he was on his deathbed.
Yes, he died in Devon, in the cottage that he and my mother bought for his retirement. And it was tragic. All his life, he'd longed to have a place in Devon, because the Lethbridge family come from Devon, although we were always born in the Indian subcontinent, but our origins are in Devon. And he wanted some fishing. And when he bought this cottage, it had a mile of the River Tor, both banks, with the fishing rights. They were very good, not salmon, it was too far upstream for salmon, but very good trout fishing. And he died before he could ever put a fly in the water, which was absolutely heartbreaking. But well, how much would you like me to read?
You can read as much as you like, Nemone, because I think it's really interesting and it's really important to as evidence really of what he saw.
All right, well, I'll just read briefly a description of his last days. My father had one lung completely removed 10 years before, and he'd gone into remission and gone back to work. It was extraordinary. I mean, very few people live that long after a total removal of a lung. And in the 1950s, that was phenomenal. Anyway, this was 1961. My father's cancer had returned without warning and with terrible rapidity. He was briefly admitted to the London hospital for assessment, but after a short conversation with his consultant, declined all further treatment and took the train home. Clapper Cottage was hardly the place to nurse a terminal invalid. My parents had been so obsessed with the forest and the garden, they had left themselves little time to civilize the house. They planted a lot of trees, and in the end, the forest, which is known as the Lethbridge forest, was donated to the Woodland Trust, who own it today. They'd left themselves little time to civilize the house. There was no central heating, no washing machine. I washed the sheets, now disfigured with terrible brown stains, in the river. Margaret Paxton, who was a Queen's Counsel, and with whom I shared a room in chambers, eager to help when I told her of the various problems, engaged a nurse who would move in and stay for as long as it took. Furiously, my mother sent the poor woman away. I can deal with this myself, she said. She asked the local doctor, who lived a mere 20 miles away, about pain relief. He said there was a range of heavy-duty analgesics available, but they would cause some blurring of the personality. Then we'll do without them, said my mother. My poor father continued with a regime of codeine and paracetamol. And then I described how the family rallied round. I took leave from my chambers in London. Peter, my brother, came over from his farm in North Devon, and my sister came down from Tyneside, where she was living and working. My father never complained, never mentioned his illness or its prognosis. It was gardening and fishing. He'd made a collection of trout flies out of silk thread and feathers, which were his pride and joy, and which we still treasure. My elder son has them. Later, his mind wandered back in time, and he would ruminate about Alexander's march from Greece to the Indus, about the Mughal emperors, about his own trips to Spiti and the high Himalayas. He hardly spoke about the First World War. It was as though he'd never been to Ypres or in the trenches of the Somme. Germany and the horrors he uncovered while chief of intelligence working towards the Nuremberg trials, he never mentioned at all. It was in the last few weeks of his life that he found himself back in Afghanistan during the war of 1919. That's the third Afghan war. On the last night of his life, it was with terrible clarity that he recalled and recounted an incident which he'd never mentioned before. A group of Afghan guerrillas had captured a British Tommy and arranged a party to celebrate. They killed an antelope and lit a fire of brushwood on which to roast it, using their kukris as kitchen skewers. Having eaten their barbecue washed down with homemade hooch, the guerrillas danced round the fire, inviting their captive to dance with them. Suddenly, one of the Afghans, having heated his kukri red hot in the fire, struck a mighty blow, decapitating the captive. He then laid the kukri on the stump of the Tommy's neck, causing some bizarre neurological reaction. The captive rose to his feet and danced round the fire with his captors, to their enormous merriment. After that, my father lapsed into silence. My mother sent Cherry and me to bed. I slept till 9 o'clock when I went downstairs, leaving Cherry still asleep. My mother was sitting by my father's bed, which had been moved to a position by the living room fire. Daddy has just died, she said, dry-eyed. You'd better telephone Mrs. Ford. I'm going for a walk. I did as I was told. Mrs. Ford was a little woman from the village who traditionally laid out the dead. She arrived soon after on the back of an old massive Ferguson tractor, a stout little figure like someone from one of Shakespeare's histories. I walked down the river where I cut armfuls of Himalayan balsam, purple like the rhododendrons at Chakrata, where I'd spent my toddlerhood, to lay beside the coffin. I returned to the cottage. Mrs. Ford had done her work well. Someone had already delivered the coffin, and she sat proudly and said, her hands folded in her lap. She was joined by my mother and Cherry. The coffin was open. Just a piece of gauze over my father's face. He looked very well. The years had rolled away, and with them the lines of pain and confusion. I thought what a handsome man he was. Jimmy, that was my late husband, arriving late that evening, said he was the bravest man I ever met. Major General John Sidney Lethbridge, CBCBFC, had been in the house of his dreams with its mile of river for less than a year. He'd never cast a trout fly in the water. Sorry, but it was just too much.
Thank you. That was a very moving account. I think that, you know, what you were saying, Milo, about kind of the inspiration of the past and the objects and your grandfather's story gives you. I think it's a wider lesson for us all, because, you know, you went into Hitler's bunker, the heart of darkness of the Third Reich, and it was physically dark, but the death of those children and everything that the Nazis within that bunker, all the things that they'd done. But yet men like him stood up to that. They did what was right. They brought light back into the world and took that darkness away. And I think that's the eternal lesson. And in many respects, it's part of the eternal gratitude that we should all have for men like him who have done those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Paul. One of the things I'm most proud of in terms of his career is the fact that he absolutely stood up his entire life and didn't stop. We talk about resilience today. My God, this generation, wow. And he came across one of the concentration camps when they liberated Germany. I'm so proud of that. You know, the Holocaust is one of the worst episodes in our human history. Innocent people being murdered by these monsters. He stood up to that. They stopped it. That is fantastic. To this day, I'm so proud. When you see people in the street and think, you know, they have a civilized life because of people like this. They have peace. You have children playing out and doing, you know, that is all down to these guys. You know, these men and women who are just phenomenal. And he, to me, always boxed clever. You know, they put people in their roles. They never asked people to do jobs they weren't capable of doing. He was clearly a very intelligent man and ruthless in his decision making to be successful, and that's always inspiring.
There's a friend of ours who was part of the prosecuting team at Nuremberg said that he had the reputation of being the most ruthless general in Germany.
He seems to be somebody who kind of delivered that ruthlessness with a kind of smile, though, as well. A very human being.
We were thinking of a story. You tell it, Milo.
Well, yeah, although clearly a very nice guy, but his reputation was he was utterly ruthless. And I do see that in some of the family who are, you know, there is a ruthless streak in this family that is very effective. And there was a very funny story that when he was, I won't read it verbatim, but when he was, so after the Third Afghan War, he was in India. He went to Staff College in Quetta, and he passed out first in his year. But in the plains of Quetta, there were these irrigation tunnels, and they held a mock battle when he was in Staff College. And what they did in the mock battle, the Royal Engineers, they did it on a rota. So somebody would be nominated to lead a group. And in that group, you would be marked down if you failed. And so this guy who was utterly incompetent to lead was elected as the leader. So my grandfather, being my grandfather, just said, this is not happening. So basically what they did, they tied him up and they hung him in one of these irrigation tunnels and just said, right, we're gonna win. And they basically won the battle. And then only at the end of the battle, they went and said, listen, if you want to come down, you're going to sign that this is okay. And then they let him down once they won. But they would not be led by an incompetent person.
Excellent.
And I always feel that sometimes when, you know, people annoy you, just tie them up in a tunnel and get the job done.
If only that was possible.
I'd be spending all my day doing it. Well, I think that kind of leads me to this question then. If your father, Nemone, and your grandfather, Milo, if there hadn't been the First World War or these wars, what would he have done? What would he have been, do you think?
Oh, he'd have been in the army.
You would.
Yes, everybody in the family, all the male members were in the army, right back in the Indian Army, right back to the days of the John Company, the East India Company.
Yeah.
How many were in active service, the Lethbridge family, in 1914?
Oh,
On the
about
Western Front.
16. Yes,
Yeah.
somebody did a member of the family wrote a piece.
Yeah.
In fact, there were 16 or 18 members of the Lethbridge clan in France.
We still have some of your Uncle Bob, so his brother was in the Royal Artillery, and again, very distinguished soldier. They just always were.
We've got a picture of wipers,
Yeah.
a certificate that was given to people who had been through the Battle of Ypres.
We have that.
It's called wipers.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
got his name on it.
we've got those actually. I don't know if you want to if I put those up on the screen, I can share those, and
Oh,
you can
yes,
perhaps talk
sure.
us through some of those photographs and
Yes.
that
Yes.
certificate.
Yes.
Okay,
Have we got the Churchill photo there? Because there's a story behind that Milo needs to share for sure. Because I've tempted viewers with it.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think that one's amongst it, but I'll put up what we've got on the screen.
We'll come back to that then, okay,
We'll
Milo?
come back to that.
Absolutely.
I might be able to download that and use that in a minute. Bear with me while I just do this bit.
Well, shall I tell the story of the Churchill one?
Tell the story. Tell the story.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you. Well, let's just talk through the photographs first, and then this is your picnic. Do you remember this one? It's in the book.
Do. Yes.
Yeah.
That's my little brother Peter and me.
Where is that, Nemone? Where was that taken?
Black Dog somewhere?
No, that.
Kent.
I think it was in Kent. Yes, at the very beginning of the war, my father took a bungalow for us in Kent at Harwich during the Battle of Britain. And we only moved west when he thought it was safer to go down to Somerset, because Kent was getting a lot of bombs. But I think that's probably in Kent.
I can see on his uniform there, with his ribbons, he's got the military cross as the first ribbon on there, and then his First World War and Afghan War ribbon. So that probably, like you said, it's early Second World War rather than the end of the Second World War.
Yes.
Oh, yes, and by the age of the children, because Peter there is obviously very young. Now, Peter was born in 1935. Yes. Oh, that is our Maybach, which had belonged to Himmler. And it was requisitioned. We had two, actually. We had two Maybachs, both of Hitler's. And in the front passenger seat, there was a handle which you held with your left hand, where you stood up with the Hitler salute with your right arm.
Gosh.
Good grief.
What happened to them? Do you know?
They were still at Hereford, I imagine. But I mean, the vehicles were requisitioned and distributed among the British.
Yeah.
That's my father in the year of his marriage, 1925. Taken in the photographers in Simla, or Shimla, they call it now.
Wow. Very young and very handsome.
Yes. It's extraordinary that the First World War doesn't seem to have left any marks on his face,
Yeah.
which surprises me. That's his wedding. And that's Holy Trinity Church in Simla. My parents were married, and I was baptized there.
Have you been back there, Nemone?
I've never been, to my regret. I've never had the money to go back to India, but my brother and his wife went a few years back, on a sort of pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's lovely.
Yes, when my parents got married, they put their wedding presents up for auction. And they wanted this to be, and they to finance an expedition to Tibet. They went on foot from Simla to Tibet for their honeymoon.
Lovely. That's amazing.
They were appalled to see a notice in the window of the auctioneer saying, "The elegant effects of Captain J.S. Lethbridge, R.E." And it was supposed to be done very discreetly. That was for everybody to see. And my grandparents were so humiliated.
But I love the fact they did it anyway, and they went off to Tibet, which is something I'd love to do myself.
And Milo, you were talking about remembering seeing his medals on the wall of his study. I mean, you can see there, as the soldiers call it, their rose garden, where he's got his ribbons on his tunic there. Just, you know, the extent of his service from the First World War through to the Indian General Service Medal for Afghan after the First War, and then the World War II medals. Quite extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the wonderful thing about the internet is, you know, for all its ills, it's new information comes to light all the time. And we found his obituary in the Royal Engineers Journal, and we never knew why he got an MC. We were completely confused, and we didn't know whether it was first or second, but it turned out it was the Third Afghan War. It was, and we got a description of why he got an MC, and you know, he was basically in a defence of the Battle of Thal, which was he was under shell and sniper fire while he was basically reinforcing the defences and fighting that battle. So, you know, it's amazing because every medal has a story behind it, right? And they don't give them away. So, yeah, immensely proud of his service and what he did.
And that's the certificate that you were talking about.
Yes. Wipers.
That's it.
Yes.
And it's interesting because, funny enough, I was talking to a professor at the University of Kent about this very organisation yesterday. It's called the EAP League, and they were formed from ex-servicemen like him to create an organisation to perpetuate the memory and the sacrifice of those who'd served at EAP, and also to raise money for ordinary working families to travel there to visit the graves of those who'd fallen, or their names on memorials. And when you joined it, part of your kind of subscription, if you like, went towards that, and they gave you one of these certificates. So EAP obviously meant quite a lot to him in a strange kind of way.
Yeah. I think the one of the stories that always stuck with me, the fact that you know, you had this generation who went to war and so many of them perished. It was appalling. From his year at school, everyone was killed, bar him and one other who was left blind. You know, an entire generation of young men gone.
Yeah.
And it's just baffling. It's just absolutely baffling to think that.
I wonder if you could say, Paul, just by joining this, you know, okay, there were no kind of physical marks, as you said, Nemone, but again, this is a mark on him, isn't it, that he joined this? So it did leave its mark. You know, he needed to go forward in some way with EAPS in his mind and doing something for those who had lost, you know, relatives there.
Oh, yes. And he held in total contempt the sort of the people who'd skipped the war, the hard-faced men who did well out of the war.
Yeah.
He didn't stand them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think every soldier who serves, I mean, in the Great Wars is particularly the case, they always have a place that is kind of their lodestar to their experience of war, for often both good and bad reasons. And obviously, I think the fact that he had this and joined the EAP League, obviously that was all part of it for him. Sorry.
Oh, that's his wedding.
Oh.
Simla.
Yeah.
I don't know why they changed to Shimla now.
But it's funny. Again, on the right hand side is his brother. That's Uncle Bob Lethbridge, who was in the Royal Artillery. And you think the guy on the left is his best man?
Yes.
Yeah. He's got some medals.
Yeah, he does.
He's also got the Military Cross and the 1914 or 14-15 Star on British War Victory, but he's got a multiple bar General Service Medal, which could be possibly Iraq as well as Afghanistan, because those were all conflicts that happened in the immediate post-war world.
You don't know who he is. You don't know his identity.
We must look it up. I don't remember. Was it the Viceroy is there, who was Lord Reading, and his wife, and that's my grandfather
On the far right.
on the far right.
Yeah.
And the girl in the big hat in the back row is my Aunt Buffy, and in front of her is my American grandmother, Frida. And the chap next to her is Lord Reading, who was then Viceroy.
It's a lovely photograph. I love the dresses.
Yes.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
And the little children, the page and the little bridesmaid. Yeah.
Yeah. Incredible photograph.
Yes.
15th August 1925.
Yeah. Is that the final photograph, Paul?
I think that is. Bear with me.
So, Milo, would you like to tell us
Yes.
about the Churchill photograph?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just going into the mundane life of work, I arranged to meet a former colleague to have a gossip and a catch up and have a moan about work. And we arranged to go for lunch at an Indian restaurant in Covent Garden. So we went in and, I walked in, it's probably 200 tables, huge place. And I walk in on a Monday lunchtime and they say, have you booked? And we're the only two people in there. And I said, no. I said, so they say, where would you like to sit? And I said, well, we're going to sit over there. So we go to the other side of the room, we sit by the window, we have lunch, we have a moan, we have a very good lunch. And then as we go to leave, there's pictures all over the wall. And there's this picture of Churchill with these Indian Army regiment. And I recognised my grandfather immediately. And I've never seen this photograph before. No one's. And I said, that's my grandfather. And the waiters were saying, no, mister, that's Mr. Churchill. And I'm like, no, it's not. And I was like, can I? And I was like, that's my grandfather. So thinking quickly, I just took a photograph of it. And I brought it home to Mum and said, that's your dad. And she said, yeah. And then funnily enough, and again, I'd never heard him speak. I'd never seen anything. About the same time, this British Parthay film came to life of him talking in, we think it's in the Gardens, 10 Downing Street, when he was talking about the Lethbridge mission to basically turn the full weight against Japan. And it's just, you could put them side by side, and it's so lovely to hear him speak for the first time ever was a real moment. And I was able to show Mum, and I was able to show my Uncle Peter, and it was really lovely moment to hear him, to get that voice back into our. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah. So we'll put a link to that, won't we, Paul, afterwards?
Yeah, we will.
So other people, we can't play it, unfortunately, but it is worth listening to. It's lovely, and it immediately takes you back, that voice, doesn't it, to that period of history. So it's definitely worth listening to.
Clipped accent.
Yes.
Yes.
It's lovely.
But it kind of reminds you just that still these guys had, because you look at the horror of what that regime in Japan was doing at the time, and the atrocities. And this resolve, just like, basically, we're going to throw everything at you. We're coming for you. We're going to beat you. We're going to beat you well, and it won't stop until you're beaten.
Yeah.
And that was the attitude. You know,
But
we don't care how scary you are, don't care what you're doing, we're gonna come beat you.
Yeah, but it also ties into what you were saying about your grandfather, was that he was utterly ruthless, and you know, that's what he's saying. Yeah, I am, and I'm not going to stop. I think he says we won't stop. We'll just keep on going.
Yeah, and you'll be utterly beaten. And in the family, you know, in our family sort of folklore, the one thing that always sticks with me was what he always would say, and that was, beat your enemy, beat them well, never humiliate them. And that was his golden rule. You know, that was it.
Yeah.
And that's the lesson for everybody today.
Yes, yeah, particularly, today. I think at this point we should probably move to questions, but before we do that, I'd just like you to think, don't answer now, but when we did Twitter Spaces, and we talked about your grandfather, it was to kind of address that sense that history had almost forgotten him, and you were very keen to make sure that history doesn't forget him, and you wanted to talk about his legacy. So after we've had questions, we would just come back to you, and if you wouldn't mind, both of you, just sort of again repeating here how you would like your father Nemone and your grandfather Milo to be remembered by history. But if we go to questions now, Paul, is that okay?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So if you've got a question that you want to ask, rather than kind of put your hand up and talk, if you can just pop something in the chat box there, then I can read them out, and then we can pose those questions. So if you've got a question, put it in the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom there, and I'll read that out. I'm just checking that there are none there. Nope. So not at the moment. So if anyone wants to say anything, pop it in there. Okay, we might come back to that then.
Okay.
You've given a full and frank account, you see, and so therefore no questions remain.
Yeah. No, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about what would he do had he had there not been the war and so on. You know, clearly the guy was a very good engineer, and I still have a great love of the Royal Engineers, because I think, you know, they've got such skill, they're so talented, and he's clearly a clever guy. I mean, unfortunately I didn't inherit that sort of engineering brain, but you know, clearly they were utterly brilliant.
Oh yes, he put, when he was in intelligence, he put a bug underground in Berlin and bugged the Russian headquarters. And the bug was there for about a year. Yes, and they got a lot of interesting information in the dying days of Stalinism. And then one day it was discovered that some of the equipment bore the legend property of the GPO. So he wasn't really able to repudiate it.
Yeah.
And I remember that was in the press at the time, caused some amusement.
Yeah. The James Bond stuff, it's just all borrowed from the post office. It's
Yes.
Extraordinary.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So I think, should we conclude then with, oh, hang on, have we got one there? Oh, can you talk a little bit about his ties and experience with the US military?
With the US military?
Yeah.
Yes, he made great friends with his American counterparts when he was in Germany. And this friendship was lifelong. He got on very well with the Americans. And this is something that comes out in the thesis written by the chap from Nottingham. They found that he was very much on the same wavelength. He went to Washington quite a lot, yes. And his great friend was somebody called General Francis Miller, who was an American general. And he used to come and stay with us in Somerset. And he remained a lifelong friend. But of course, my grandmother, my mother's mother, was American.
Yeah.
So he already had
family
this.
came to Virginia.
Yes.
Which again is, it's almost strange in fiction. The Appomattox, which was a family house in Virginia, the ceasefire for the Civil War was signed in the drawing room at Appomattox.
Mm.
So, so when there's a conflict, we're normally there somewhere. Yes.
History literally runs through your veins, doesn't it, Milo and Nemone?
Yeah.
Yes.
What
Yes,
a privilege.
Appomattox
Mm.
is now owned by it was donated by my first cousin who had no children. She was the last member of the family. It was donated to the state, to the equivalent of the American National Trust.
Yeah.
And
That's
so it's
still there.
open to the public now.
There we have a message there from Alan Fraser saying thank you. As a Virginian, he appreciates it.
Fantastic.
Oh.
Fantastic.
Wow.
do go and have a look at Appomattox, and it's all still there, and it's now belongs to the state, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
We have that little chair from Appomattox.
Yeah, no, we
we
have some things from Appomattox in the house. So
yes,
that's nice.
Wow.
Facts, we'll have to do another one.
So shall we kind of wrap up now, do you think, Victoria?
I think so. I think we've probably, I mean, I just want to say thank you because you've been so open with us about your father's life, and obviously some very upsetting parts to that, you know, and so thank you, Nemone, for that lovely reading. The first one was fantastic. Obviously, the second one was extremely poignant, and I know it's very difficult to read. It's hard enough to write something like that, but to actually read it aloud, it's very difficult, as was obvious. So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
thank you. Forgive me. If I realised, I don't think I would have done it.
Nothing to forgive, Nemone. Honestly, absolutely nothing. I've written about my own father who died, and I'm the same. I always respond in exactly the same way. I say it's hard enough to write, but to read aloud something so personal is difficult. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an extraordinary session with you. So, I mean, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us like this and talk about his extraordinary life and how it's kind of woven its way through your own lives and what it means to you. So I think that's the whole purpose of what we're trying to do here with talking history with Humphreys and Reed is to kind of put some light on some of these stories, because considering what your father did, he should be an incredibly well-known figure of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And you know, and hopefully in the years that follow, that will change.
Let's hope. Let's hope.
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's been a real privilege to be here and to talk about him and his wars. Because you're right, you know, my grandmother was an intensely private person in many ways, and it feels extraordinary that he's not more recognised. And I'd love to put that right.
Well, you are. So, sorry, I was just going to say, if you'd both like to have the final word on
Oh,
him,
I wanted to say thank you to you because you're such lovely people and so sympathetic, so nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take that, won't we, Paul?
We will.
We'll
Yeah.
take that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, we'd like you to have the final word then, and tell us how you would like your Major General Lethbridge to be remembered.
I'd like him to be remembered as a great state soldier and a great human being.
Yeah.
And a very brave man. What Jimmy said about him was he was the bravest man I ever met. And this resonates with me because Jimmy was a brave man himself. And he recognized it.
Well, a good place to end, I think. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, until the next time, talking history with Humphreys and Reed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.